morning, everybody. This is Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute, and I'm happy to welcome you to the November 2020 version of our Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. We're holding it at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and probably most of us have already finished our actual breakfast, but it works out very well. I was up until I didn't return from the election night party I attended until about 2:30 this morning, and I had to get up and participate in a large conference call at 7:30 a.m. So I think I'm probably at least as sleepy as any of you, and boy, are we not living in interesting times. Wow. I encourage you to live tweet today's event with hashtag WWCV. In 2020, the Leadership Institute has trained now a total of 5,051 students in 267 individual training programs. Since 1979, your Leadership Institute has trained 227,709 students. At the end of this event, you'll be redirected to the training schedule on the Leadership Institute website. There you will find all of our scheduled upcoming trainings. I urge you to take a moment to review these schools and consider attending one or sending a friend to a training. Now, there will be a chance to ask questions at the end of our speaker's talk this morning, and I ask you to use the Zoom Q&A function to submit a question should you have one. And now I present to you Ben Woodward for the brief programs report. Ben is the Director of Communications Training at the Leadership Institute. Prior to working at LI, Ben worked in the United Kingdom Parliament as a researcher to the Honorable Chris White MP and as a caseworker for Paul Upal MP. Ben grew up in Haleswan, a small industrial town in the United Kingdom, and studied political science at the University of Birmingham. And when he first came to the US in the summer of 2015, Ben personally interned for me. He is a fine fellow, and we are happy to have him. And believe me, he has legal status in this country. It wasn't easy to get it. In Ben's spare time, he enjoys traveling, cooking, and fitness. Ben, you're on.
And thank you, Morton, and thank you to everybody for being with us virtually today. No doubt a lot of very tired, very anxious people on today, and I hope this breakfast will be a bit of a light in your day today. So I won't take up too much of your time, so I know that you're all excited to hear from Eric Eggers, our speaker today. In August, after 4 years of working for the Leadership Institute's Career Programs Division, I was really honored to be able to transition into a new role, heading up communications training. It's important to fulfilling the Leadership Institute's mission to increase the number and effectiveness of conservative activists and leaders in the public policy process cannot be overstated. So far in 2020, the division has trained more than 830 conservatives. To put that into perspective, in 2019, the division trained 806. And so with November and December still ahead, we're on for a good increase in the number of people, the number of conservatives who have been trained by the division. In October alone, the division conducted a public speaking workshop, an advanced public speaking workshop, 2 on-camera television workshops, a public relations school, and private trainings for the interns of the Family Research Council and the American Legislative Exchange Council. Looking ahead to the rest of 2020, the division will be supporting communications professionals on the Hill and elsewhere by hosting a workshop on December 1st for aspiring communications directors, where they'll learn how to work with the media, manage constituent outreach, and improve the digital performances of their offices. And we've already got 59 conservatives signed up to that, with still a month to go, which is exciting. The division will also be hosting a written communications workshop and more on-camera television workshops. The success of the division in 2020, despite a lot of the challenges presented by COVID-19, is a huge testament to the talent of the studio's director, Jared Cummings, and the division's coordinator, Tiffany Roberts, who recently won Employee of the Quarter in recognition of that, which is very exciting. Among the other divisions, Grassroots is working hard on their 2021 training schedule and their upcoming campaign school with the River School of Government. Digital Training is partnering with the Prosper Group to deliver a post-election digital campaign school. External Affairs are producing the upcoming infographic. Events recently hosted a wonderful all-staff Halloween party, which we all really enjoyed, and we're excited to see what they come up with for Christmas. International Training is preparing for a tentative International School of Fundraising in Munich in July 2021, which we're all really hoping can take place. And then finally, career and political training are looking forward to the upcoming campaign management school in December and the Capitol Hill staff training school. None of these opportunities would be possible without the Leadership Institute's generous donors. I cannot thank you enough for making the Leadership Institute's work possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. You're doing a great job, and I know in your new post you're going to achieve a lot. And now I'm introducing our featured speaker. Eric Eggers is a researcher at the Government Accountability Institute, most notably investigating voter fraud, a very interesting topic. And I have no doubt that as we meet, there's a lot of voter fraud going on in big city political machines. His recent book, Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Elections, exposes the felons, illegal immigrants, and corpses who prevent honest election outcomes in America. His book explores which members of Congress actually lost their races, which counties have registered voters listed as over 200 years old, and what regions in America have over 100% voter registration. This work has exclusive interviews with whistleblowers who have seen the fraud firsthand, and backed by state-of-the-art forensic tools and elite investigative acumen. The book Fraud analyzes the voter rolls to show how the numbers just don't add up. Eggers is a former radio producer and talk show host. He produced the film, you may remember, Clinton Cash, The Creepy Line, and he's been featured in PragerU presentations, which is certainly a wonderful organization. Eric lives in Tallahassee, Florida, which on the map last night looked all red. I encourage you to ask questions and use the Zoom Q&A function throughout Mr. Eggers' talk, and he will have time to answer some questions at the end. Mr. Eggers, you're on.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Morton, for that introduction, and thanks to the Leadership Institute for being here. Like you, I was up somewhat late last night, and but I have 3 small children, so I was not permitted the luxury of sleeping in past 7:30 this morning. Okay, so I'm a guy you guys have probably never heard of, who wrote a book you maybe didn't read, but like, here's why you should listen to me, because literally what I talk about in the book that Mr. Blackwell just referenced is exactly kind of what we're wrestling with, I think, right now. We've all seen what's happened, and we've all seen, if you went to bed last night and you saw Donald Trump with a lead in Michigan, and then you woke up this morning and magically 138,000 votes were transferred to Joe Biden. I think it's fair to ask questions, right? And one of the things that I talk about in the book is the systemic vulnerabilities that American elections have for interference through nefarious political actions. And so, the reality is that the pandemic has unfortunately exacerbated the many different ways in which our elections are rife for potential malfeasance, right, and fraud. So why is that? The Supreme Court cited statistics from a Pew Center study in 2012, and they found, right, when they ruled about Ohio's efforts to make their elections more secure by removing dead or legal voters from their voter rolls, which really is sort of like the central issue to American elections, right? It's the voter roll. Because once you get onto a voter roll, then you can cast a ballot. There's really nothing to be done to stop you. So the Supreme Court said, hey, look, 24 million voter registrations in this country, that's 1 in 8 are wrong. And why that matters is because now with a pandemic, when some states have mailed everyone proactively a ballot, some states like Michigan mailed everyone an absentee ballot request form. That means that those ballot request forms are going places where voters aren't, right? And so it just creates opportunities for political organizations or political activists to do something with them. That's what happened in New Jersey, right? In May, Paterson, New Jersey, the state of New Jersey conducted their first ever all-mail election. And in June, elected officials in the 3rd largest city in New Jersey were arrested for actively stealing ballots and compiling them. They later activists would say that they weren't just stealing ballots, but they were actually creating a database of signatures to be able to forge ballots in the future, right? And anytime you have extra ballots are going places where legal voters aren't. There's 350 counties in this country with more registered voters than citizens of legal voting age. We're seeing a lot of eyes on Michigan right now. Well, the city of Detroit, remember Michigan last year, or 4 years ago, went to Donald Trump by 11,000 votes. I don't know what the margin is right now, but it's something I think is like 20,000 in favor of Joe Biden. Well, last year, the city of Detroit and the state of Michigan was actually sued because an analysis found the city of Detroit had 30,000 more registered voters than citizens of legal voting age. So, that's one example, right? Pennsylvania, another very closely contested state. Pennsylvania has seen a long history of election fraud problems. Remember, the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania, actually after the election in 2016, resigned quietly, and then subsequent documentation would reveal that he was actually fired by the Democratic governor because of all the problems they had in their election, including presiding over what they called a glitch that allowed for illegal immigrants to vote in Pennsylvania, right? And then the city of Philadelphia, which has been, I think, correctly scrutinized, has a long history, unfortunately, of voter problems. Their primary this spring, they had to pause. They didn't actually certify the votes in Philadelphia over a week after the actual primary because they had to stop and go back and find instances of double voting and just being able to kind of track all the ballots. And that's unfortunately consistent with basically the story of the massive increase in mail-in balloting during the pandemic era, right? Wisconsin was one of the first states to do it. And they saw, tens of thousands of votes discarded. They saw employees complaining they had to work over 100 hours in a week. Just keeping track of them all has proven to be very problematic in many states that matter a lot in a presidential election. And that, unfortunately, kind of is where fraud thrives, right? Fraud thrives in areas of chaos and areas of disorganization. And so those voter rolls, which we referenced, that's where you want to start when you take a look at the problems. I would expect to the extent that this is going to become something that is viewed electorally, right, or viewed legally. And you're going to have court battles over ballots and where to count. Like, I expect to hear quite a bit discussed about the problems with America's voter rolls, because like it's one thing to have, you know, erroneous registration problems, but it's another thing to exploit them. And the evidence that we have shows that they're very easily exploitable. So the city of New York, this is an example. The city of New York said, all right, well, how easy is it to kind of track this stuff down, and how easy is it to take advantage of voter registration problems? So they sent undercover investigators a few years ago into different boroughs and precincts in New York City to try to cast ballots on behalf of people that you know, shouldn't be legal voters, right? Whether they're people that were deceased, whether they're people that were felons, whether they're people that were not legal citizens. So they identified 63 registrations they wanted to exploit, and they attempted to cast ballots on behalf of these 63 registrants. 61 of those 63 attempts were successful, right? Meaning that people were able to successfully cast illegal ballots 61 of the 63 times they tried to do it in the city of New York. And then one of the other 2 times they tried to do it, they were unsuccessful. They were only stopped because they were trying to cast a ballot on behalf of a felon who was incarcerated in New York State, and the felon's mother happened to be working the polling place. So, you know, and that was the only reason why they stopped it. So we know we've got problems in terms of, you know, the issues and exploiting the vulnerabilities in these systems. So, you know, so how does that happen, and why do they perpetuate? One of the things that we've explored in the book is the idea that anytime states try to clean up their voter problems, they're stopped by lawsuits that are funded by, you know, organized efforts by the left, many of which include funding from Soros-linked organizations. And so, you know, like, so look at the state of Ohio fought Mark Elias, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign attorney in 2016, when they tried to remove illegal voters from voter rolls, and they tried to implement voter ID. The state of Georgia had similar issues. The state of Indiana had similar issues. So at every turn, these states find, you know, legal opposition to be able to take steps to improve election integrity. And at the same time, people that fund the lawyers that are trying to keep American elections vulnerable fund organizations like the formerly named Acorn, the formerly named La Raza, to then go out and roust up as many voters as possible and like kind of shove them through those vulnerabilities that the lawyers fight to make sure still exist. So, you know, that's how you have kind of really weird outcomes. But, you know, and I'll talk about this, and then I'll just talk about one other kind of thing I think was worth paying attention to, and then, you know, we could kind of ask questions, Morton, or kind of however you want to do it. But I would say the, you know, we know that 4 years ago, there was a lot of talk about how many illegal immigrants voted, right? That was, you know, Donald Trump cited statistics saying, hey, I lost the popular vote by 3 million people. There's been studies from Old Dominion professors and elsewhere that say as many as 8 million illegal immigrants may be registered to vote. You know, that will not be the talking point this year, right? This year, the talking point will be about these absentee ballots, because we've seen this massive increase in them and the impact that those have had on the election. And the reality, sadly, to the extent that this election is going to come down to absentee ballots in and around the area of Detroit and in and around the area of Philadelphia, I mean, the reality is that even the New York Times has said absentee balloting is by far the most vulnerable form of voting to fraud, right? And the cities like Michigan, who have had election officials prosecuted previously for actual voter fraud. Philadelphia, literally earlier this year, had an elections judge charged with stuffing the ballot box. It's like almost out of a cartoon, right? He waited till the polls closed, and he went into the polling booth and took as many ballots as possible and shoved them in there because he was being paid by political campaigns. So the reality is that right now, America's elections hinge on the form of voting that's proven to be the most susceptible to fraud in the areas with documented histories of fraud. So that's not excellent news, but it is reality, and that's kind of where we're at. And I'm happy to kind of talk more about that if you'd like. But I would also just sort of draw your attention to just one other thing that we've witnessed, I think, this year, that has been, in my mind, unprecedented, but I think it's really interesting. So Morton mentioned that I produced a film called The Creepy Line, and that's available on Amazon if you want to watch it. If you guys have seen the movie The Social Dilemma on Netflix, it's very much like that. Ours came out a couple years ago, and features interviews with Jordan Peterson and other just sort of sociologists about the history and the impact that Google and Facebook specifically have had on American society. But we also feature extensively an interview with a guy named Dr. Robert Epstein. And Dr. Epstein's been doing research on this for a long time. And one of the things he talked about in the film was what the impact Google can have on American elections through a variety of things. Not the least of which is how they rank search engine results and how they autocomplete search engine queries. And you've seen, if you've been paying attention on social media, you've seen some people kind of flag this. He calls it search engine manipulation effect. And and he's done a lot of research on that. And they proved that Google was obviously in the tank for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. Eric Schmidt famously was at Hillary Clinton's election night rally. Even sort of worked on behalf of the campaign in some way. But if you notice, this year, every time you logged on to Twitter or Facebook or even Google, you saw these kind of get out the vote messages. And Dr. Epstein, one of the points Dr. Epstein makes in the film, and this is the reason why I bring it up, is he talked about how these guys can target. They have so many data points about us. These guys can target who they show get out the vote messages to. And so if they decided, right, to only send, hey, reminder, go vote messages to registered Democrats or Democratic super voters or Democrat undervoters or whatever it is, just the amount of power that these companies have on, influencing the electorate. And there's no way to know about it, right? And there's no way to kind of prove it. And it would essentially be the equivalent of a major election commission contribution that would violate all sorts of laws. But I think we've seen on some level, some form of that this year. So just another thing I think to kind of pay attention to and flag as troubling, and just another area that we shouldn't take for granted that these companies now have this power. So so I guess I'll pause there. Morton, if there are questions, I can talk more about who we are at the Government Accountability Institute and kind of some of the stuff we've done historically. Our research incidentally kind of led to Donald Trump's campaign ended up using our research when we wrote the book and did the film Clinton Cash. It was about the Clinton Foundation and the cross-pollination of people that donated to the Clinton Foundation, that then sought favors from the Department of State when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. And then ironically, we worked on a book called Secret Empires, and that book is actually the book that launched the narrative that about Hunter Biden and the offshoring of corruption and the ways in which foreign interests pursued family members of politicians as a way to influence American policy. And then obviously that research is what Donald Trump was asking about in the conversations that led to his impeachment. So it's kind of weird, we're here in little old Tallahassee, Florida, and our research was used, by the Trump campaign to kind of help get him elected. And then ironically, our research was used in what led to Trump's impeachment. So, we're just sitting down here, drinking our tea and watching everything unfold. But it was an interesting time at our election night party. I'll just say that. So with that, I'll pause. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to address them.
Eric, there are a number of questions. I asked everybody at the outset if you have questions to put them in the Q&A section, which is displayed at the bottom of the screens in this display. A number of people have put in questions and comments in chat. I've asked Deirdre Hackelman, who organizes these events, to handle the Q&A, and I trust that she has reviewed those who have questions that they've submitted. Probably better give a check to the numerous people who have, despite my request, put in items in the chat, but I'll turn it over to Deirdre. I may intervene a bit in the Q&A myself, but Deirdre, lay out the questions for Eric, please.
Yeah, so I'm seeing a theme already in the questions. So I'll kind of compile a few into one here before we start to fatigue, because I think we are all a little worse for wear after last night. So a few of the questions are about, you're talking about all these ways that the elections are not honest, if you will. What are some things that maybe we as citizens can do, or through the political process do to increase the integrity of the elections? I'll ask a little bit of a leading question out of my own curiosity, and some of the research that I've done on you is talking about, can you address blockchain technology and how that can help with that and compared to other countries? So
Sure.
Emphasis on that.
So I think the common link there, right, is that we are a third world country, right, when it comes to election technology. And so, right, I mean, think about like the ways in which you voted. Like I voted yesterday in Florida. We have Scantron technology, right? It's like you fill in the bubble and you slide it in there. And that's one of the reasons why you saw Florida's votes be fairly quickly. Like in Florida, we are so jacked up to not be at the center of the election problems this year. Okay, you guys are welcome. So like Florida A+ last night. So but and that doesn't seem like fancy technology, but compared to some of the ways other states do it, it is, right? And that's why I think so many people, myself included, were raising these questions about, hey, you got this massive increase in absentee ballots, you got this massive increase in ballots that are coming via the mail. So there's just so many more ways for them to fail. And so the technological kind of hindrances are very real, right? Now, so the answer, but the good news is technology can be part of the solution to both parts of Deidre's question, right? So what can you do about these problems? Well, yeah, you can be a monitor, right? You can like get some eyes in the places where eyes need to be just to make sure that the ballots that are legally cast get counted and get put in the right places. That was part of what was so troubling about some of the things you saw on social media yesterday coming out of Philadelphia, right? You saw people that appeared to be credentialed, certified, legal poll watchers, legal election, kind of volunteers to help ensure integrity, and they were turned away and prevented from doing the thing that appeared they've been trained and permitted legally to do. So that obviously doesn't increase confidence in the legitimacy and security of the outcome. The good news, why is technology to answer that? Because we know about it, because people took pictures of it, took video of it, and then put it on social media. I was actually part of a panel in Minnesota a couple weeks ago with one of the Project Veritas guys, and he made, I thought, a very good point, is that everyone now, right, has this, and this is the same technology that members of the news media have. So like everyone now can be a citizen journalist. Everyone now has the ability to take photographs, take videos, and put it to the world where people can track and see like whatever instances of questionable behavior regarding elections are taking place. So I think that's part of the solution, right? So get engaged, become a poll volunteer, become somebody that helps make sure that things that are supposed to happen are happening, is that. And then, Deidre mentioned blockchain technology. It sounds like she's done excellent research and she's had to listen to at least one of my speeches before when I've mentioned the fact that countries like Estonia, right, which is former Baltic state, Eastern Europe, like not necessarily known for really many things, but parts of Estonia have used blockchain technology, right, so the decentralized holding of different pieces of information to help conduct elections. And, they've done it securely, right? West Virginia actually experimented with that and did it successfully a couple of years ago for the first time in allowing members of the military to cast ballots from overseas over their cell phones. So, I mean, there are better and more secure ways to do it. The technology exists. It's obviously a massive lift in terms of investment in it. And obviously, the good news, part of the reason why you hear people say election fraud can't happen on a scale large enough to matter, is because of the decentralized nature in which we conduct elections, right? Every state does it differently. Even every county can do it differently, right? So elections are only as kind of valid and secure as the counties in which, and the supervisors of the counties that conduct those elections. Ironically, I'll note, Florida historically, I've talked about in my book about Broward County's supervisor of election, a lady named Brenda Snipes. And, we had problems in Broward County 2 years ago. We've had problems in Broward County historically. So they ended up having to remove Brenda Snipes after so many problems. I mean, Brenda Snipes was so bad in Broward County. It's like the second most populous county in Florida. Her website said that Dr. Brenda Snipes has presided over, quote, some successful elections, right? So, but anyway, they removed her. They put in this other guy. And so Broward County elections went awesome last night. And it actually led to an increase in voter turnout and votes for Democrats, right? Because it's a heavily Democratic county, counties have run well, more votes get counted. So, I mean, we should be in favor of all votes counting and being done legally. So all that to say, but they can't happen because it's decentralized. So it's hard to get all these decentralized areas to accept one uniform technological solution. And so I would say that's going to be, the challenge there.
Okay, we do have a specific question about corpses and illegals. So the question is anything being developed currently to stop, deceased people and illegal immigrants from voting?
So that gets back to, so just to be clear, right? When we talk about dead people voting, we're talking about people on the voter rolls who have since died, sadly. And the names remain, and so that there's a legal registration that someone could cast a ballot on their behalf. And fun fact, that actually would be the only form of election fraud that would be considered voter fraud, right? So lawyers will tell you that the way that voter fraud is defined is intentionally under-inclusive, because voter fraud technically, according to like the Brennan Center and other people that say voter fraud is not a real thing, is that voter fraud is only an act of intentional voting on behalf of a legal voter by an illegal voter, right? So voting as on behalf of a dead person would kind of fit that example. The voter rolls have to be examined, they have to be cleaned up. And so that's why it's so troubling, when states like Ohio, states like West Virginia, states like Indiana want to take a look at their voter rolls, and then they're stopped in the name of voter suppression, right? And say, oh, you're just trying to keep people from voting. California just settled a massive lawsuit with Judicial Watch. Judicial Watch found like 2 million people on their voter rolls that weren't real voters, right? People had died, people had moved. To be fair, some conservatives have sort of a role in this. I was doing a radio interview with a talk show host, and I mentioned the issue of, when you're registered to vote in more than one state because you moved or whatever, some people can lead to double voting. We actually did a report at GAI, the think tank that I work for, that found over 2,000 instances in 2016 of double voting in Florida alone. People casting a ballot in Florida and casting a ballot in the second state, because they own property there and they're on the registration rolls. And I remember asking this talk show host, or talking to him about it, and he said, yeah, I'm actually registered to vote in more than one state. I moved, I'm still on the rolls there. And I said, well, how come you haven't told, the state that you are not a resident there anymore? And he said, well, because it's none of their business. So, we have we have to sort of be like helpful citizens that way. But I think that speaks to the problems, right? Is it's so reliant on self-reporting. Like, you have to tell people, hey, my grandmother died, take off the voter rolls. As far as illegal aliens go, one of the ways in which they identify illegal immigrants that are on the voter rolls is the fact that if you're registered to vote, then you get jury duty. And so people, shocking, like, don't want to do jury duty. So legal immigrants get jury duty notices, and they write in to say, hey, please remove me from the voter rolls. And like that's one level of analysis for this problem. But it is a serious issue, right? It's like, because of the 1990s legislation that called the National Motor Voter Rule, you can register to vote when you get your driver's license. But as we all know, the threshold to get your driver's license is very different than the threshold to vote. And so it's just like one box you check, and then you become registered to vote. And by law, like, the DMV official isn't really permitted to tell you, hey, like, to kind of walk you through the citizenship thing. Plus, it's not really their job. They're not equipped to do that. And the only thing to kind of stop the non-citizen from registering to vote would be the text on the box that you're checking, which is written in English, maybe not a language in which they're overly proficient. So it happens all the time. And, I heard you mention that Ben is a legal citizen, and good for him. But the reality is that many people, like, if you register to vote and if you actually vote as a non-citizen, it's like a capital offense. There was actually a British gentleman in Illinois. He was a priest. He'd been living in the country for 7 years on his track to getting citizenship. But then, like, the last stages, they went back and said, hey, you've actually been voting. And it was true. He got deported and had to go back in line and start the process all over again. So it's a real problem. And, like, actually, it's kind of my favorite angle of it all, because to me, like, to the extent that Democrats are the party that says, hey, we welcome immigrants, we want to celebrate them and we want to create pathways to citizenship and all that. But because they fought so much to keep America's elections vulnerable, they've actually, in my opinion, victimized these group of immigrants that they claim they're there to protect by endangering their citizenship and resident status. So hopefully that answers your question.
So we have a few questions about the current election, and you may not be able to answer them with the news cycle going.
Like, I've got the TV on up here, so I kind of am watching it, but yeah, I'll do my best.
Excellent. So we have a few questions about whether or not we've already seen in this election certain states' voter rolls being higher than the number of eligible voters. Is that the case yet? Do you know? And if so, do you think that will be addressed, or how has that been addressed in the past?
So the only way that would have occurred, right, is if we saw, so you see these states, right, talking about like X percentage of precincts reporting, right? No state's going to have 100% voter turnout. So I doubt that we'll see, in fact, I feel very confident in saying that we will not see a state count more votes than they have legal residents. If that happened, then obviously that would be flagged. But I do think that, and again, this is sort of why I say, states like Michigan, states like Pennsylvania, states that have been proactive as far as mailing ballots out, mailing absentee ballot request forms. And then, Pennsylvania, they will still accept absentee ballots till Friday. And, and I think they still have to be postmarked by Tuesday, or at least that's the case now. And that would be to me, that's kind of what I'm watching. In 2018 in Florida, we had a Senate race and a governor's race, be very close, very contested. And you talk to the lawyers involved in this. I'm not a lawyer, but as part of my research, I speak to a lot of lawyers, and they will tell you that the thing they watch and things they worry about is the effort by Democrats to change the rules legally while the game is still happening, right? So, like we said, we were only going to accept ballots like this, but now, hey, look, you don't want to disenfranchise these voters, right? So let's accept these ballots. I mean, you saw in Virginia, the Supreme Court had a rule that said they would only accept ballots that had a postmark on them. But that means that the Virginia Attorney General was arguing that they should accept ballots with no postmark, right? Potentially opening it up that the ballots would have been cast after the election day. So, but even that we're there, that we're arguing over postmarks, I think just speaks to the problems and why we should be having questions and concerns. Because, like, it's one thing, you go to the polling place, you cast your ballot, it's counted, right? But when you start to get, the further removed you get from that process, there's just more steps in the way. So, like, my friend is a teacher. I know you guys are in DC. I don't know how many people, well, this is a younger crowd, so I don't know, probably nobody has kids, but like a lot of people I know in the DC area in Northern Virginia, the kids are doing like remote learning, right? In Florida, we have brick and mortar schools because we have a Republican governor, and because I'm not concerned about my kids' health. So hey, send them to school. But the point is, like, my friend that teaches and she's got kids that do remote learning, she says one of the challenges is that, like, there's just so many more ways to fail now if you're a kid that's doing remote learning, right? Like, it's not just, hey, do you understand the material? It's, is your internet connection bad? Your speakers not work, right? Like, did your thing freeze up? And I think that's a metaphor that I think applies perfectly for the form of voting and the election result we're now seeing. There's just so many more ways for ballots to fail the further removed you get from casting a ballot, right? Like maybe the ballots get lost or discarded, which happens. Maybe the signatures don't match, which happens, right? Maybe you've got a heavily partisan board that's reviewing the ballots, like what they have in Minnesota, and they're disproportionately inclined to not accept certain ballots, which happens. So, so I think those are the things I'm more concerned about now than the citizenship voter roll percentages.
Okay. We have a few questions about, I think, kind of from a research perspective. A lot of people, sounds like they're interested in doing their own research. So how did you go about getting voter roll data from each state?
You can buy it. That's what you have to do. So you can request it from the Secretary of State's office. Some states you have to be a resident of that state to be able to get it. The costs vary wildly. So like that's actually, we did a report on voter rolls that led to the book, right? So we did a report on the rolls, and then the publisher, reached out and said, hey, would you mind doing a book on this? So, so some states are more expensive than others. And so that's why we ended up only acquiring, I think, 37 of the 50 states versus of roll data. But there's there's organizations out there that kind of like focus on specific states. So California's got like the Election Integrity Project. Texas has got True the Vote. And so I encourage anybody that wants to do their own research, let's go. That's great. There's a lot of very fertile territory. And so I'd reach out to those organizations, maybe start with a look at the work that they're doing. Minnesota's got the Minnesota Voter Alliance. And that's like, if you're a data person and you love Excel and love kind of sorting things, I mean, there's all kinds of crazy stuff in the front.
Few people are asking if you think that there will be time or if the effort will be put in to investigate fraud in this election before it's called.
Yes. I mean, all you have to do is check the president's Twitter feed this morning, and my media calendar is filling up. So I expect that we'll see. I absolutely expect it to be a talking point because. So what happened? So 2018, right? 2018 was the first election that California legalized this thing called ballot harvesting. They did it in 2016. 2018 was the first election in which it was permitted. So ballot harvesting is the third-party solicitation, collection, and delivery of ballots, meaning people in California can legally go up to your door, say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, I'd like to help you fill out your ballot, and they can collect it, and then there's no cap on how many ballots they have and how many ballots they can drop off. And in 2018, the first election in which that was permitted, 7 congressional districts in Orange County, right, which is around the Los Angeles area, traditionally like one of the few Republican strongholds in California, 7 congressional districts went from Democrat to Republican once ballot harvesting was permitted, right?
Went from Republican to Democrat, you mean?
Correct, yes. Went from Republican to Democrat. So, so that raised some eyebrows, right? And said, hey, wait a minute. So now that we've got third parties involved in this ballot collection delivery process, it all seems to be skewing one way. Incidentally, in the first package congressional thing that the House, Nancy Pelosi's House, considered and attempted to pass, did pass actually after the coronavirus pandemic. In addition to like the stimulus and things like that, there was a voting section, and their voting bill would have done 3 things. It would have nationalized mail-in balloting, meaning they would send everybody a ballot. It would have eliminated voter ID, meaning you would no longer have to have an ID to register, vote, and cast a ballot. And it would have nationalized the legalization of ballot harvesting. So, I mean, I think a lot of election integrity people were very concerned by that, but they also thought it was very telling. So, all that to say, now Democrats are the ones that do it, but these different states have had different rules about it. And that was actually one of the things in the Project Veritas video in Minnesota. You have this campaign worker going around and whatever else you think about it. They have him on film with hundreds of ballots. And at the time, the law in Minnesota was you could only have 3 ballots. So, that's an example of, clear violation of election law. So I expect that to be a talking point. I expect what's happened in Philadelphia in terms of election workers being turned away. And, the lawyers, I think the one thing I will say is that the lawyers typically know where these things can occur. And, I mean, that's how fraud is identified. and litigated is by the lawyers, right? Because the system itself, if you're an elections official, your job is to conduct an election, and your job is basically evaluated based on the effectiveness of how many people vote. You're not going to be, as an election official, incentivized to be like, hey, sorry guys, I just allowed 50,000 illegal immigrants to vote, or sorry, we had a lot of voter fraud. And that's one of the things we talk about is, unfortunately, the incentive structure is flawed in favor of election vulnerability.
We've had a couple of questions about mail-in ballots. Do you see any way to make mail-in ballots, and that can be, including the absentee as well? Is there any way to make that safe or secure?
So yeah, let's define our terms, right? So absentee balloting, like the process by which you request a ballot in the mail and then send it back in, has been happening for a long time. Totally legal, totally legitimate, and isn't in and of itself a problem. Mail-in balloting, the process by which state officials or local election officials decide to mail everyone a ballot or an absentee ballot request form, whether you ask for it or not, I think that's where the problems on the voter rolls become problematic, right? Because now you've got this massive increase in ballots, and that's where you see all the problems that we've seen in states like Wisconsin, states like California. California had 100,000 ballots get discarded because you got signatures that don't match, or the ballots get mailed in after the deadline, things like that. So, so all that to say, is there a process by which it can be secure? Yes. Those processes include some of the stuff we have in Florida, where you have to have an ID to register to vote, which not every state requires, and you have signature verification. But the problem with that, this is one of the issues that came in with the Michigan lawsuit, is that there's no training or uniformity when it comes to how do we certify signature authenticity, signature verification, things like that. These are either volunteers or not necessarily, these are not forensic scientists, right? They're trying to analyze these signatures. So, and there's not a ton of guidelines. So it relies upon the elections officials to have appropriate training protocols, and that is not something that's consistently done.
I'm gonna have to leave the call because I have to chair another meeting at noon. But before I leave, I want to ask a question, and the predicate for the question is, while certainly there are documented cases where Republicans have worked voter fraud and attempted to or succeeded perhaps in stealing elections, but it's pretty clear that the Democrats have made this into an art form. I mean, they are really skilled about it. We don't currently have a whole lot of information about what is going on, for example, in Pennsylvania. A friend of mine last night said the reason they stopped counting the votes in Pennsylvania overnight was they needed to figure out how many votes that they needed to steal. And so, while understanding that we don't have all of the evidence of whatever fraud there may be going on, how, where the election system is entirely in the control of people who are as power hungry and as corrupt as Hugo Chavez or Maduro in Venezuela, what could they be doing right now to steal votes?
So, it's a good question. And I guess the only thing I would sort of add to it, as you mentioned, I think it's interesting to compare that to two different political regimes. As you guys know, you guys are living in Washington, D.C. right now, and the city of Washington, D.C. has been boarded up, right? As have made many major cities throughout the country, because there's concerns about, rioting, looting. And we've seen that over the last 6 months in different instances. And sort of for people that want to say, hey, they're not really concerned about voter fraud, it can't happen on that large of a scale, and why would somebody do it? The two things I would say is what we're seeing right now is evidence that A, it doesn't have to happen on that big of a scale to make an impact, right? We're literally talking about thousands of votes that are going to swing a presidential election right now. And B, to me, what the looting and the rioting before and the boarding up of buildings today proves is that you've got a group of people that happen in this case to be Democrats that have proven that they're willing to blatantly violate many societal laws, in this case in the form of like property laws. So is it really a stretch to think that people are willing to violate election law for a desired political outcome, which is like way harder to enforce, and there's virtually no consequence to it, right? So, I mean, that just, I think, is a good frame to think through the incentive structures, once again, that we're talking about. Now, what could they actually be doing? So my answer to that is, what have people done historically? And so that is A, forge ballots on behalf of registrants, right, with or without their knowledge or participation, which is documented to happen. And I think one of the reasons why you noted that Democrats tend to be more proficient at it is because it happens in major urban population centers, which historically are populated by and run by Democrats. So things like housing complexes are major centers for it. Nursing homes, the practice of targeting senior citizens actually is done so often in Florida, where I live. It's called granny farm. It's got its own term. So, so they could be forging ballots. They could be what the elections official in Pennsylvania did, like just creating new ballots, right, and shoving them in the system, which has happened before. They could also be identifying ballots cast by, like buckets of ballots cast by Republicans and putting them in an office somewhere, for the next week or so. So, those would be the three ways right off the bat that you could see something like that happen.
Deirdre.
Right. We have a few more questions about notarizing. So there's, I think a lot of people aren't familiar with that process. They're wondering, why do some states do it and why do some states not do it? And how in the world do they actually check it in any kind of timely manner? Is it really actually being given the scrutiny that it would need to?
So this is a question about like the states that require notaries to be able to send in absentee ballots.
Yeah, I think you mentioned signature analysis.
So, okay, so signature analysis is different than notaries, right? I mean, notary obviously is like the most extreme example of verification. You got to have a stamp. And in my experience, have an overly helpful person who wants to chat when you just want them to sign the dang thing, right? Come on, lady, I got places to go. So, it's a great question, because the signature verification is, in Florida 2 years ago, there's a lot of stuff that a lot of people who, it was actually their signature, and they say, hey, my ballot just got rejected. It was my signature, but you know how it goes. Like, signatures are not, we're humans, we're flawed, right? There's a reason we have to click that button every time we go to a website that says, I'm not a robot, because so we duplicate things not consistently. So in Florida and other states, they have a process called curing, which if there's time, hopefully they have to contact the voter and say, hey, your signature was rejected, but you now have time to go do that. And that was one of the subjects of the lawsuits 2 years ago, is how much time you're going to give to cure the ballots and things like that. But it's it's a real problem. There is no uniformity in terms of the standards, in terms of the instruction and the verification. And that's why a lot of people correctly raise concerns about it, because of exactly, I think, the premise of the question you just read.
So is there a way to tell if you've sent in an absentee ballot, if it's been counted or not?
So a lot of, again, it sort of depends on where you live, right? Because it's so decentralized. But in Leon County, where I live, you can you send it in and they allow you to track it. So your ballot's been delivered, your ballot's been counted. So some counties, because of the increase in mail-in balloting, have done that. I think that's a very useful and helpful tool. And you can always just call the elections office and say, because the one thing is they do track, have you voted, right? And so you can always call or check online if your system is set up for that, to verify your ballots been received, your ballots been counted.
Okay.
And if there's concerns about it, then you can cast what's called a provisional ballot, right? Say, I want to cast a provisional ballot, and then say, all right, well, this person, we didn't get their mail-in ballot, and we have this one, and we'll count that.
Okay. And then I think a good question to end on here, since we're running out of time, is is there any low-hanging fruit? So you've mentioned a lot of ways to clean things up. What is already in the process of being cleaned up? What could be very soon? It's just kind of some low-hanging fruit in that way.
Low-hanging fruit as far as like things that might be done to improve election integrity. I mean, to me, it's going to be ID, right? Like you should like that's one way to make sure the people that are registered to vote are real people, and then to have so require that you have an ID when you register to vote. You know, if you want to get on an airplane, if you want to purchase an alcoholic beverage, not that anyone did that last night, or if you wanted to, ironically, go to the Democratic National Convention in 2016, you would have had to show ID to get in, right? So I don't think it's a stretch. I don't think it's disenfranchisement, and I don't actually think it negatively impacts any population group disproportionately to require people to have ID to register to vote and to actually vote. And then the second thing I think would just be, so I'd stick with the ID thing for starters, and then just more uniformity when it comes to what the standards are, what technology we're using, and you know, like what processes that we have kind of nationally, and then verifying the voter rolls with databases. That's the other kind of major problem is the voter rolls that we have in states, they're not routinely or regularly cross-referenced with citizenship databases, social security databases, or other states' databases to make sure that double registrations are removed. So cross-referencing and the ID would be the two.
Okay, great. Any parting words of encouragement or discouragement from you today?
Yeah, I was thinking about this morning. I guess here's what I'd say, right? Because I was talking to the pastor of my church, and he had a couple of people in his office like crying this morning, just like they're so stressed out about it. And I know, you know, young conservatives, you guys aren't probably like this with your comfort animals on the airplanes and things, you know. But like in case anybody's like super freaked out, the two things I would say is like, what we're actually witnessing is what makes America beautiful, which is like, hey, military, I don't think military is not going to show up, right? Like we will have people are going to fight about it. They're going to scrutinize it. They're going to argue about it in court. And then eventually, like someone will either stay in office or leave office peacefully. And, you know, because that's the way adults do it. And so I think what we're witnessing, like all the stress about it is actually kind of like it's a great way of celebrating the system that we have in place. And it also say, and I've had to have this talk with a few people, you know, at least in Florida where I live, it's a beautiful day, right? It's a beautiful day outside. Like everyone in your family that loves you yesterday, they still love you today, right? Your friends, you still got a job, you're still in school. So like, this is stressful and they'll figure it out, but everything that was good about your life yesterday will be good about your life today. And maybe if you find yourself being overly anxious, maybe kind of camp out there.
Well, that's lovely. I love that message as well, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us today. For it was a real treat, and I'm glad we ended on a positive note.
Hey, my pleasure.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
And to the audience, please join us on December 2 for our next virtual Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast with Brent Bozell. I encourage you to RSVP online at leadershipinstitute.org/breakfast. And thanks all of you for joining us today. Until next time, stay well.
Thanks so much for watching this video. To watch our latest video, click here. And to make sure you don't miss any future videos, be sure to subscribe.